Welcome, everybody, inside the Parisi Palace, high above 2919 East Broadway. This is the Jake Feinberg Show on KEVT Power Talk, 1210 a.m., Sahuarita, Tucson. Thank you so much for making us part of your day today. I started my show the day after Gabrielle Giffords was nearly assassinated in Tucson on January 8th, 2011. The entire community was in a state of shock, and for this host, I was just trying to get my sea legs on the radio. While the community was mourning, my guest was going through a transformation of his own, from Space Navigator to family pillar, from Desert Storm Patriot to healer, from an abstract belief in God to a deepening in his faith. My guest sat by his wife's bedside while she healed. Because of modern medicine and competent surgeons, she survived, although some close to her did not. She rehabilitated in the finest clinics in America, slowly relearning to speak and eat and all other daily living skills we take for granted. Maybe my guest did too, but after that tragic day, he was by her side every step of the way, pulling from the cosmos a deep well of intestinal fortitude that he poured into Gabby. As she mended, the couple realized they had reached yet another demarcation point in their lives. No longer was she just a politician and he a gutty astronaut. They were now public figures that gained international attention for overcoming the odds. Whether or not they wanted this, natural events gave them no choice. Maybe it was not having a choice that changed my guest. As we sit here today, my guest's identical twin brother just broke the record for most consecutive days in space by an American astronaut. My guest has taken his fair share of trips into space as well, using what we know of modern engineering. His aerospace acumen is such that he became a NASA space shuttle pilot in 1996 and made 4 trips into space, including the Space Shuttle Endeavour in 2011. He is also a Navy captain and naval aviator, flying missions in the first Gulf War. While he has consistently sacrificed for his country, he is now an American searching for responsible solutions in one of the most irresponsible times in our country's governmental history. Mass shootings have occurred in South Carolina, Connecticut, Colorado, and Oregon since January 2011. And despite heavy support from President Barack Obama, no legislation has been passed to limit the ability of unhinged or mentally unstable individuals to get their hands on assault weapons. Nothing has been done to change the background checks before you can purchase guns. We have a society that glorifies violence, and many big companies who would just assume to see the status quo stay the same. That's where my guest comes in, rallying victims' family members and trying to change hearts and minds so that our kids are safer, our discourse can be more civil, and a more pragmatic approach to governing can evolve. Just a simple twist of fate. Mark Kelly, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Well, thank you, Jake. Thanks for having me on. That's certainly the longest introduction I've ever had.
Yeah, well, I do my monologue with all my guests, so there's nothing special going on here. So it's an honor, but it is an honor to have you, and thank you for taking the time today, man.
Oh, you're very welcome.
You know, I just wanted you to talk a little bit. You were born in '64, and, you know, we had touched down on the moon. I just wanted you to talk to the audience about the first event in space that really, as a child, sort of awed you.
Yeah, so you would think it would be Apollo 11 and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin first walking on the moon, but oddly, I don't remember that.
Right.
My brother does, but for some reason I don't, and I think it's because when Neil stepped down that ladder in July of 1969, where I lived on the East Coast in New Jersey, I think it was around 10 or 11 p.m., and I was in kindergarten, and my best guess is I fell asleep. So I don't remember, but my brother Scott does. I think my real first recollection of our nation's space program probably was around Apollo 14, because I do distinctly remember Alan Shepard and the fact that this was the first American in space now walking on the moon, and that he was a naval aviator. And I remember just images surrounding him that had to do with the Navy. So at that time, I imagine I was probably in the first or second grade, probably in the first grade when that happened.
Wow, interesting stuff. I was going to ask you, just the personal pride you have, the feeling that you have inside. I mean, it's just funny that we're talking now, and your brother just set this record. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to you and your family that that he has taken on this mission? You guys have done a ton of missions before, but this one is a little bit different.
It's a long time in space. It's a big commitment.
Yeah.
We have never sent an American into space for this period of time. A year. It's a long time. He actually broke 2 records recently. One is he is now the American with the most time in space. He's also the American with the longest flight. I think that record was yesterday, or maybe the day before. But records are there to be broken, and Scott is looking forward to the day when somebody breaks his record for the most time in space, and that's going to happen. Probably will happen. I mean, there are a few astronauts at NASA now that have a good number of days in space, and if they fly another long-duration mission, they'll exceed the amount of time. But he's the current record holder, and he's proud to having had that opportunity.
Do you get to? Are you able to communicate with him at all?
I just saw him on TV, but I get to talk to him about every day or every other day, probably every other day on average. He'll call. Space Station has a phone. Can't call up. You can only call down. It's a pretty good connection. So probably about every other day I talk to him.
Mark, it's just so classic. It's great to talk to you about it. I am not an engineer, farthest thing from it. And so you talk about stretching our capacities of what we know in engineering and this mission. Can you talk? People say, well, I mean, is there a chance that we'll ever wind up living on another planet? I mean, can you talk about some of the basic reasons of why your brother is doing this mission? What are the outcomes that are most important at this point?
Well, first of all, ever is a really long time. So when people say, will we ever, I think the logical answer to that is yes, because that's an infinite amount of time. So we can engineer things and figure things out if we give it enough time and effort. The primary purpose of sending somebody into space for a year is to just extend our experience with long-duration spaceflight. We have a lot of data on a lot of people out to 6 months. The Russians have sent people into space, not intentionally, but they've had people stay in space for a year. But this was a couple decades ago, and probably actually 3 decades ago now, nearly. But they historically don't do, a fantastic job about collecting data and doing the science. They do a better job at it now, but if you go back to the 80s, say 1989 or so, they didn't do a great job at it. So this is our first attempt to extend that experience from 6 months to a year. And we need to know what it's like to keep people into space for a long period of time. If we want to send humans to, visit Mars at some point here, whether it's mid-2020s or mid-2030s or beyond. So this is our first attempt at getting more data on those long-duration space flights.
Can you talk specifically about the kinds of physical things that you're looking for in that 4 months additional?
Yeah. It's a hazardous environment. I mean, there's a significant radiation environment that you deal with when you're not, adequately shielded by the Earth's atmosphere and the Earth's magnetic field. So that's the environment that the space station is at. Zero gravity also has some adverse effects on your body. You lose bone mass and muscle mass when your body realizes it doesn't need all this. It doesn't need this big skeleton or all this muscle. You start to get rid of it, so that's an issue. We've got issues with astronauts' vision in long-duration spaceflight. Their optic nerves, some changes happen to it. It gets inflamed, and their vision starts to deteriorate. So we have, and your immune system gets affected. We're not so sure why. So we have all these issues with the human body. And one of the things we're going to have to figure out if we want to send people to Mars is how do you keep them alive and healthy and able to do their jobs?
Right.
And you certainly don't want people to come back from a trip like that and then, one of the downsides is it significantly affects your lifespan. So we have a lot of problems to solve, and that's one of the reasons we send somebody like my brother into space for a year.
Talking to Mark Kelly here, astronaut and part of the Americans for Responsible Solutions, among other things. Can you talk specifically about, if I remember correctly, your last trip into space was with the Space Shuttle Endeavour in 2011. you talk about that trip specifically and how that went for you?
Yeah, well, I was the last commander of Space Shuttle Endeavour. We launched on May 16th, landed on June 1st. We brought a 2 billion cosmic particle detector up onto the space station and successfully installed it and did a bunch of other stuff. It was about a 16-day flight. Unfortunately, it was the same period of time that Gabby was recovering in a rehab hospital in Houston, Texas. So while she was, even during the mission, I think it was the third day of the flight while I was rendezvousing with the International Space Station, I had also deal with, this big personal issue, major personal issue. Gabby was even in surgery while I was in space.
That's what I was saying.
During that last flight. So it was quite the exercise in compartmentalization, and trying to, not worry so much about what's going on in your personal life and being able to do your job under some added stress.
Yeah, I was going to say, I just find it remarkable that you were able to keep yourself composed. And how many months were you up? How long were you up there for?
Oh, it was a 16-day flight, space shuttle flight. They're typically around 2 weeks.
You grew up in, you're a Jersey cat, and I'm an East Coast guy myself, but both your folks were police officers?
Yeah, my dad was a cop for about 25 years. My mother, I think, for probably around 10.
How did they teach you about using guns safely?
Yeah, there was always guns in our house, because they needed them for work. When I was young, I remember getting a BB gun, pellet gun at one point. But, it wasn't something I did a lot when I was younger. My first experience, with firearms, like real experience, was when I was at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy and first went to qualify with I believe it was the Mark I rifle. And then later, as a pilot in the Navy, you have to, you carry a sidearm, was not all the time, but certainly when you're flying in combat like I did, so you have to qualify with that gun. And then I, later, when I was going through flight school, I did some hunting in Texas. But as a kid, I remember my parents telling me to stay away from the gun. This was in New Jersey in the 1970s and 80s, and, I don't think gun safety, was what it is today. And but I remember taking it very seriously, and my parents being really serious about it. But it was part of their job.
Did you do you look back? I mean, I was born in '78, and growing up, this recent, just in the last 5 or 7 years, these mass shootings that have occurred, kind of new to me. And to me, it's funny. You can turn on the TV, and I mean, you're looking at video games. Everything is so. I mean, you got half robot creatures walking around with semi-automatics. Do you, looking back, was there a time where we changed and the glorification of violence became heightened? Have we always been a society predicated on enjoying violence, especially gun violence, or has that fundamentally changed in the last maybe 20, 30 years?
I don't know. I mean, I do know that, just as when you look at long-term trends, I mean, violence is down. I mean, if you go back hundreds of years, we used to live in a much more violent society than we do today. Mm-hmm. But to follow up on something you said, these, mass shootings are certainly, I mean, all the data indicates that they're, they come at a much higher rate than they are now. They also get more attention, but they are more mass murders with firearms in this country than there has been, in, most of the last century. So that number is up, and gun violence continues to be, a major issue in this country. We have 15 to 20 times the death rate from gun violence than other industrialized countries. Something around 33 to 35,000 people a year are murdered with a firearm, and we can do a lot better than that. We can, I think with, some reasonable legislation that does not infringe on, your responsible person's Second Amendment rights, that we can, reduce those numbers significantly. So that's what we advocate for. I'm a gun owner. Gabby's a gun owner. I feel I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. At the same time, we can keep guns out of the hands of criminals, people who are dangerously mentally ill, domestic abusers. And I think everybody needs to be, behind that.
I guess my question is, like in football, to protect the safety of the wide receivers now, no longer, they've outlawed helmet-to-helmet hitting, okay? So it evolves, right? There's a change, there's a fundamental change. And, okay, the Second Amendment, it was about, when the nation first got on its legs, it was about protecting your family. There wasn't law enforcement. I mean, fundamentally, it seems to me that there has to be some sort of reality check about that. We are 200 years, we're well beyond that. And evolution has to occur. And the idea that going back to this sort of the middle ground, I don't see how you're going to get anything passed without a fundamental shift in saying, this is dangerous, we need to change it. Without, and I just like to talk to you about that because you're on the front lines.
Yeah, well, you say it's about protecting your family, as our country started. Other folks will provide a strong argument that it's, it was about individuals being able to protect themselves from their own government. I mean, that argument is often made. I mean, you'll see it in presidential debates. So, why did we put a Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights? I think that's certainly up for debate. Was it to be able to relate, to raise and arm a militia because we didn't have a standing military, or was it to people to protect themselves from the government, or was it because we were a more rural society and people needed, there wasn't, law enforcement that could help people? I think, at this point, I don't think it matters all that much. What does matter is, the Supreme Court said in a ruling, called D.C. versus Heller, that Americans have the right to own a firearm to protect themselves. But Anthony Scalia's opinion also said that the government, certainly has a right to regulate what that means and what that is.
Scalia said that.
And I think we can pass laws, at the state level. We see a lot of that now. Our organization has worked really hard to, pass some strong legislation in a lot of state capitals. We get bipartisan support in a lot of different places. We need strong federal legislation as well. But we actually, this is one of those things. You often hear the term, you can't have it both ways. Mm-hmm. We can have it both ways. We can have, people can have strong rights to own firearms for whatever reason they want. At the same time, we can make it harder for criminals and other people, dangerously mentally ill, domestic abusers, to get guns, and we can do better as a society protecting children, protecting our citizens, and driving down gun violence. We actually can have it both ways.
Can you tell the audience? I mean, it's so funny because there's a lot of sort of hand-to-hand combat on the Hill that takes place on so many different issues. Can you explain to the audience, like, for instance, this white supremacist in South Carolina who killed these people in the church, he got the gun. The federal background check came back 3 days later. He would not have gotten it if they had done that. He had a felony on his record. And so what I'm trying to say is, what is the defense? I mean, what is this defense? How do they get to a point that they can stymie that? That seems like illogical not to do that. And on the flip side, what are you doing specifically to push back against that at the federal level? I understand you're doing stuff.
Well, first of all, going back to the first part of your question, who is they? Who are we talking about?
I guess I should have made that point. The NRA. So what I'm getting at is what is the NRA doing in the hand-to-hand combat to be able to stymie something that says you don't need to, we don't have to wait on the federal we don't have to wait on a background check in order to sell a gun to somebody. How do they convince anybody especially after what happened. What is the rationale? I can understand protecting your family. I get that, Second Amendment. This is something where it's like, keep talking about a loophole. Okay, that you could talk about that to your blue.
But you're working under the concept that you have to logically present an argument to somebody to convince them logically that this is the right thing to do. But you're missing the point that that's not how our government works. We have built a system that operates through a lot of influence and money. There's money in politics. And when there's money in politics and there's influence that organizations have, in this case, there's a really strong lobby that their interest is basically to sell as many guns as possible. So they don't have to logically convince a member of Congress, why they should vote or not vote for a certain piece of legislation. They have the influence. All they have to do is say that they oppose this or they, back this piece of legislation, and they'll get members of Congress to line up without having to, make a logical argument.
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely. No, you're absolutely right.
That's
and
the situation.
Believe me, I know. No,
and the gun lobby, specifically the NRA. They've done a fabulous job of building an enormous amount of influence in Washington and state capitals. They've done a really good job at it. You got to give them a lot of credit. So logic doesn't. That's not the first priority in a lot of cases.
How do the Americans for Responsible Solutions? Do you just work at the state level? How do you counteract the money influence and the NRA influence on the federal level?
Yeah, the way we do it is we've got to kind of do what they do. Until the laws change, until campaign finance laws change. We raise money, we spend it on elections. We do lobbying. We try to explain to members of Congress and state senators and assemblymen and state legislators, why this is important to pass this legislation. And sometimes, people will say, yeah, I really want to protect, families in my district. And, other times, they don't want to cross a very powerful lobby. So, we do the best we can under the rules that we currently live under.
Right, laws, right. And can you talk about a specific, something that you have done as an individual based on life circumstances and, being put into this position of common sense gun control? Can you talk about a specific time when you actually changed hearts and minds of people and that they said, oh, okay, I don't need to get reelected because the NRA is going to fund me. I'm going to actually do it because it's the responsible thing to do. Can you talk about a specific thing that you have done with a specific legislator?
Yeah, we've had. I don't want to,
you don't have to name
private
anybody.
Conversations, but I've had, United States senator who said to me, at one point that, because of the influence of the gun lobby, that this could cost her next election. Then she immediately said, well, it's the right thing to do, and I'm going to do the right thing. So you have people like that. You also have people that at the same time will say it's the right thing to do, but they're not going to do it because, it has political consequences. So, we've got, I'll say this, people who will, serve in office, it's a really tough job. They're being pulled in all different kinds of directions. There's all kinds of influence out there. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of people that, want them to vote a certain way or not a certain way. I think in the long term, I really feel that, our organization and what we advocate for, we're on the right side of this argument. We want to protect people's lives, especially children and women. most, children being the most vulnerable people in our society. And we can do that without preventing or without, affecting anybody's Second Amendment rights.
Right.
And it's not that hard. There's just some really common sense things we can do. There's legislation we can pass. We should pass it on the federal level. We should do things like, having a universal background check. We should pass laws that are anti-gun trafficking laws. Laws that concern the nexus between guns and domestic violence. There's all this stuff we can do. in time, we will. I'm convinced more than ever we're going to be successful.
Why?
Why? A number of reasons. One is, we've seen momentum in a lot of different places. Just demographically. You look at demographics, and there are less, gun owners in this country than. So there's less people like me, right? I own 6 guns. I look at myself as a responsible gun owner.
Right.
I think, more people live in cities than they did, 20 years ago. And when people live in cities, they're less likely to own a firearm. So I think people are starting not to care so much about it. And what's really important to them is, their kids are safe in school. That becomes, more of a driving influence. So, and just even though we've had really struggled at the federal level, in a lot of states we've had a lot of success, and it's also what the people want. Like, you poll on these issues.
I know.
If you were to do a nationwide poll on, and just ask the question, should people get a background check before buying a gun? No questions asked. That polls at around 90% nationally. There's nothing that polls at. Like ice cream and free money poll at 90%. That and background checks.
Well,
even here in Arizona, it's I think it polls it's above 70%. And if you were to ask a question about gun trafficking, do you think we should have strong anti-gun trafficking laws? That would probably poll pretty well too. So the public is also, I believe, on the right side, of this issue, and we'll, certainly vote that way. Now, there's one thing, answering a polling question, and it's another transitioning that into your vote for who your member of Congress is, or your state senator or governor. So that's the other thing we need to see happen.
Amidst the, like you said, Washington operates differently than regular everyday Americans and their jobs. There's a huge disconnect. What do you think? Just because, I remember sitting in South Tucson drinking a cup of coffee when Gabby was, when that tragedy occurred. And since that time, nothing has changed. And I say, our whole legislative system is based on compromise. At the end of the day, you cut deals.
You say nothing has changed where? In D.C.?
I'm just saying I'm saying that we've nothing on the federal level has changed. Not much. Not much at all. And in fact, this with the advent and the increase impact of social media, it is only heightening it. And so, what this whole thing is based on compromise. In your mind, what would bring the NRA to the table to compromise on gun trafficking, on magazine
or background checks or stuff like that?
Yeah, what would bring them?
They would have to think it was in their best interest as an organization.
So yeah,
and I don't know what that takes. Maybe pressure from other places with the non-traditional. I don't know. Maybe somebody's spouse who works there saying, we really should do a better job protecting kids in school. I don't know. That's a hard question. That's a question you should maybe present to them. I'd love to sit down with them. I've tried a number of times.
Have you tried?
Sit down with them.
Yeah.
I think it would be great if we could find something with some common ground.
I don't know. It just seems like nobody wants to infringe on anybody's ability to access, a firearm, use it, hunt, but there's also like a humanity part of it, and
yeah. Well, when they say use it responsibly, right?
Right.
Yeah, I am all for taking away the Second Amendment rights of felons. Right.
Well, and as you said,
the last thing I want is a guy getting out of prison, who's a violent felon and having easy access to a gun. But here in Arizona, like so many other places, he can go to the, in a few days from now is the Pima County Gun Show at the county fairgrounds, and if you're just released from the state prison in Florence, Arizona, and you're a violent felon, you can walk down to that, the fairground there and buy any gun you want. Nothing stops you.
just as we wrap.
Unless you realize you shouldn't be doing it.
Do you think that you will see substantive, realistic gun legislation at the federal level in your lifetime?
Oh yeah. If I thought it would be beyond that, I wouldn't be doing this.
Good, but yet you have had no success as it's, and I mean, it's been so nice to connect with you, but you've had no success face-to-face meetings with any members of Congress at the federal level.
State-to-state meetings. So we've had a lot of success with. I mean, there's bipartisan legislation in the House on background checks right now.
Really?
Bipartisan.
Yeah. It's not going to pass.
Now you got to get it to the floor to get it voted on. So maybe Speaker Ryan will be willing to allow that to come to the floor for a vote. I mean, there are Republican co-sponsors on that piece of legislation. So yeah, we've got a lot of support. Now, can we get it to the floor for a vote and can it pass? I don't know. We're trying.
Can you? One final question for you, Mark. I think it's important to talk about it. We have a lot of people on the Republican side that are running for president who come across as preachers. It seems to me man's view of God has become incredibly inflated, and they use that now to create fear. But I wanted you to specifically talk about your evolution, your belief, your faith before the tragedy, and then how it evolved afterwards as how personal an evolution it was. I'd like you to take us through that.
Well, I'm Catholic. I go to church occasionally, probably not as much as I should. It's something I believe in. At the same time, I often get this question about how did flying in space change my faith? And, well, it didn't. To me, that's my job, and I'm trying to do it safely and effectively. Mm-hmm. And, mission success and safety was the primary thing I think about. With what happened to Gabby, I, think a little bit differently about fate. Not faith, but, why did things happen? Was there a bigger meaning in all of this? And, I sometimes think maybe there was. But, evolving the evolution of my faith because of a tragic accident. Just think about where I come from and my background being a pilot and an engineer. And, I often more think about problems and what evidence do we have of a problem and what's the data and how do we solve problems? And when this happened to Gabby, my thoughts were like, well, here's all the issues we have to deal with. Here are her medical issues, even acute medical issues. She's in the hospital. Who are the additional people we have to get in, to help with this situation? And, what's the long-term road? And I focus all of my energy on that.
Yeah, no, I'm reading here, like after you said, after the tragedy, you said you found yourself wandering in makeshift memorials and shrines filled with Bibles and angels, and you pray where you are. You pray when God is there in your heart. And I just, I think it's a powerful thing. I think that sometimes you said sometimes you do think it was for a bigger cause. Can you talk about what you think, what that bigger cause was?
Well, I don't know. So you had 6 people die, and Gabby gets seriously injured, and she was a member of Congress having, a positive effect on society.
Sure.
But she can continue to serve and help people, in her current role. So, who knows why things happen.
What's Gabby doing these days? How is she doing? And is she available for an interview on the Jake Feinberg Show? Only because I want to. I feel like the discourse about. I have 2 young daughters. I am not a gun owner. I am I think part of the demographics that you're talking about. So give me an update on Gabby and if she's up for an interview.
She's doing great. She's getting ready for the El Tour de Tucson.
Uh-huh.
I think it's now for this year, it's the Gabby Giffords El Tour de Tucson, and she wants to ride 40 miles. so she's training for that. We're also really busy. Despite what happened to her and, the disability she deals with every day, she's in a great mood. She loves to help people, interact with people. So, things are going well. You can make that request.
We'll figure it out.
For an interview through Mark Prentice.
Of course. And thank you we're going to get so much rain this year in Tucson. You know that. We're just going to be covered.
Oh, because of the El Nino?
Yeah, you're in Tucson right now or no?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. No, already it's uncanny. I've been here 12 years, and, the monsoons are sporadic, but, man, I'll tell you, we are going to get, I don't know, California's going to get hammered, but we're going to be lush out here this year,
No, it's great. Our water table here in Tucson is actually pretty high, like historic levels.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking like the deep water that's underground, because we're pretty good at conservation. We really think about that out here in the desert, but, hey, this rain is good for us.
Darn, it sure is.
We need as much as we can get.
One more, what was the best concert you ever saw in Jersey?
In Jersey?
Yeah, especially before you went to college, because you were a teenager in the early 80s, and there were just so many great venues in Jersey.
Yeah, there was one in my hometown for a while, for a summer, and I would say the best concert I saw there that summer was probably Carlos Santana.
Yeah.
And that was in 1981, maybe?
I love it. And,
now I'm going to see him tomorrow night.
Yeah, and, his Michael Jensen, his communications director, wouldn't give me an interview with Carlos, so I'm still working. I'm still trying to get to Devadip, but have a ball at the concert, Mark. I'm really glad that Jonathan connected us, and I look forward to doing a part 2 down the road, and have a great day.
Okay. Hey, thanks.
Take care.
Thanks for having me on.
All the best. Bye-bye.